Why are there different levels of gluten testing in different countries?
That's a really
That
good
was
question.
one of my questions, because I'm really interested in that.
So there's an international sort of understanding in terms of 20 parts per million that something below that is gluten-free. And that was established many years ago. And since then, there's been much better ways of testing and looking for gluten. So that's looking at a food, breaking it down, digesting it in a laboratory and getting an idea of how much gluten is present. And now those tests can detect down to 3 or 4 parts per million, I should say. So they can detect even really small amounts of gluten. And the legislation in Australia and New Zealand means that if a product is labelled as gluten-free, that there's no detectable gluten present. So it might be that that food is okay in Europe because there's 15 parts per million, but because it's a different testing platform and a different legal arrangement in New Zealand and Australia, things are labelled differently. And the testing platforms and the ability to detect smaller and smaller amounts of gluten sort of hasn't kept up with some of those other things as well.
So why have other countries not kept up with the, I mean, if the testing is available to bring it down to 3 or 4 parts per million, why are other countries not managing to keep up with that? Is it just not part of their legislation, I guess?
I think that's part of it. The other part to that equation is also how much is safe for people with celiac disease. Is 3 parts per million safe for someone with celiac disease? And there's a study that's ongoing across the ditch in Australia at the moment in adults that are trying to assess very small amounts of gluten, are they safe in people with celiac disease or not? So challenging people with celiac disease with an amount of gluten. I think it's 5, maybe it's 5 or 10, I can't quite remember offhand, but
parts per million.
Parts per million.
Right.
And trying to get an idea, is that actually appropriate to restrict that or to be that strict or not? So there's some evidence, there's some studies, but there's not a lot of evidence worldwide. There's a study from Italy that looked, I think it was 15 parts per million. But there's not a lot of good evidence at the moment in terms of trying to guide, now that we can detect more, is that being over strict or is that appropriate to be that strict?
It'd be really useful to know that.
But at the moment it's no detectable gluten as and so the limitation of related to the restriction of the testing platforms.
How is food tested for gluten?
So it's tested in a laboratory, and then so it's there's different platforms, but one's called an ELISA, which is so it's using antibodies to detect that protein, and then seeing whether or not or to try and quantify how much of that protein is present. So yes, so the food's digested in a certain way in the laboratory and then analysed and put through that test, the ELISA platform, in terms of coming up with the answer in terms of quantifying it.
Is it quite an easy test? Is it quite an easy process?
Well, there are home testing things as well, so people can test themselves at home, but has a slightly simpler process. I'm not sure exactly how many laboratories do gluten testing or in New Zealand, but it's not a large number. And I mean, those sort of ELISA tests are relatively straightforward, and they can be used to detect all sorts of different proteins and quantify how much different proteins are present for all sorts of things, not just gluten, but other things as well.